My name's Dan Ritchie. I've been teaching at Bethel for 26 years. I'm the director of the Humanities program, and I have a specialty in 18th century literature. At Bethel, I've taught a lot of survey classes, survey in British literature. I taught a lot of general education classes as well, both on the freshman level and then the P courses. In a department like ours, we do have certain specialties. I teach more British literature, but we teach all levels from sophomore through senior seminar levels. I'd say my teaching style is perhaps a little more formal than others. I do think there's a strong place for delivering information, including in stand-up lecture formats, especially in the freshman and sophomore level. I try to mix that with more seminar and discussion oriented classes, and especially in the upper level, I encourage a good deal of research for the seniors and senior seminar classes. Students say that I have high expectations, and I think they respond well to that. So that's part of who I am, and I've tried to lean into that as appropriate. One of the things that's become more apparent to me over time is the importance of developing a small number of close relationships with teaching assistants. So I've developed that as well. Another strength is because I like organizing things, organizing projects, I've done a fair amount of study abroad experiences, and that's a completely different kind of teaching. Much more experiential and relational teaching. So it's been a variety of approaches. Well, building rapport, it really depends on the level and the kind of class that I'm teaching. If it's a humanities class where I'm going to be seeing the students over multiple semesters, having a good relationship in our smaller group seminars with 22 students is really important. So learning who is on the football team, who is in the Bethel choir, who might be trying out for a play, and encouraging students to see that all of what we do at Bethel is significant. I think that's important for building rapport. Certainly learning students' names very quickly is important as well. I think students learn by making connections. They have bodies of data that they can be tested on, so they know this term over here, and they may know that trend over there. But until they can connect them in some meaningful way, I'm not sure that they really learn. Let me give an example. In an art history lecture that I just came from, Wayne Rosa was talking about the architecture of the Puritan meeting house and how it's an egalitarian structure. Well, that of course was developed in the 1600s, long before an egalitarian political structure came about. Those people were all subjects of the king. But by the time we get to the American Revolution and our readings in Tocqueville, the connection between that egalitarianism in church and equality in the American political system become very important. And if we can get students to see the connection between the architecture, the religion, and the politics of America, then they really learn. Yeah, in designing a successful new course, I think there needs to be a confluence of three kinds of interests. First of all, the students have to have an interest in taking the course. Bethel students really don't take electives very much at all. So the course has to fulfill their interest in completing a major or completing a general education requirement, or maybe two at once. So there's the student's interest. It also has to fulfill the institution's interest. The institution has an interest in courses that are somehow related to our mission, or the department has an interest in somehow furthering something that we think is very significant for our majors to do. The least important, the third leg of the triangle, is the professor's own interest. But it has to be there too. There has to be some reason why I'm interested in teaching this class. And the most recent class that I've developed is a class on Islamic literature and culture. And like many people, I got more interested in this after 9/11 and really wanted to understand more about Islamic culture. I had some connections through a brother and other connections through Bethel to the Middle East, so that was my interest. Bethel students need G and Z courses, and our department had not been offering many courses, especially in that G category or the Z category. So that was kind of a perfect opportunity to develop a new course and drop some old courses in Renaissance and satirical British literature that students frankly weren't interested in anymore. So those three interests I think need to come together: your own interest, the student's interest, and the institution's or department's interests. In developing individual class sessions, I do tend to look back at what I've done in the past and then ask if it's going to work, or if it can be changed, or if it needs to be changed. And often I'll make notes right after a class ends and tell myself what worked and what didn't. Again, I think there needs to be some hook to show students why a particular element is significant or important to them. Let me give an example. One of the more difficult things for me to teach is 18th century poetry. It's written in rhymed couplets, and students tend to think that these are easy to write and that they're boring. So getting them to see the tension between the order and the energy within those couplets and the wit of those couplets is a task. So what's worked for me in recent years is to have students write their own heroic couplets. And then they see how difficult it is, how fun it is, and they can appreciate the wit of those earlier writers. But it took me many years to come up with this idea, and many years of failure, until I finally had to admit that simply standing in front of students and telling them about heroic couplets was not going to work. So in that case, it was a more experiential element that ultimately worked. During individual class sessions, my focus goes between the material and the students, and I think I'm much better as a teacher if I know the material well enough so that I can be looking at the students eye to eye and see what their reactions are, because then I know if something's working or not. I do come to class with set notes, sometimes something close to a manuscript written out, or at least heavily annotated texts. And there are almost always 3 or 4 points that I want to raise. But I think when I'm teaching my best, I'm focused on whether the students are engaged with what they're learning. And if they're not, then I usually stop and try to go in a different direction. I think the forms of assessment really vary from level to level. The higher the level, the fewer objective tests that I use, and the more I rely on students to read text without necessarily being assessed on everything. Freshmen tend to feel like they need to be assessed on everything, or they won't read the material. But upper level majors feel the opposite way. I think they'd feel insulted if they were tested on everything, and they can be counted on to do the material without that. And since ours isn't a licensure, they're not going for a licensure, there's less of a need to test on everything. However, I do still like, even in some upper level classes, to have some objective questions, for a little bit of integrity, to make sure students are reading the material. Developing a well-focused paper topic is really quite difficult, I think. I do like to give students options, but the best paper assignments are ones that I've had to develop and revise over years, because there's always a student who will misunderstand something, not because they're not trying, but because it's not written as clearly as it is. And again, the best assignments, I think, are ones that force students to make connections, or I should say that allow students to make connections between the material they have studied and their own concerns. I'll give an example from an essay question on a survey of British literature. So this is a freshman or sophomore level class. We read a couple of essays on, I guess you'd say, the theory of literature, what poetry is, what poetry should do, even in this first level class. And one essay question that I've had some success with is to ask students to analyze works by Sir Philip Sidney and Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope that have to do with what literature is, but then ask them to say, how does this material help you to love God with your mind? And so that more personal and subjective element for students who choose to write about that question allows them to make connections between this material that's 500 years old and their own concerns. The course that was filmed was a session on a poem by Alexander Pope called The Dunciad. It's a mock epic, like the Iliad and the Aeneid, the Dunciad, but it's an epic about dunces. And this poem was written in the 1720s and revised through the 1740s. Now, the students had already read a lot of satire, so I made a lot of assumptions about their knowledge of satire, their knowledge of this poet, and also Jonathan Swift, his contemporary. These are students who are mostly juniors and seniors, or students who've already had a survey of British literature, so they will have already studied Alexander Pope and other satirists of the 18th century, and many of them have also read either the Iliad or the Aeneid in other classes. So I was able to make a lot of assumptions about things that they'd studied, possibly forgotten about, but gently remind them of things that they'd already read. I also knew that these particular students have a very good sense of irony, so they would, with a few footnotes and allusions, they would catch a lot of the jokes. The purpose of this class, though, was to try to get them to see how significant the battle over culture was to Alexander Pope. I think that's why he's still valuable for us today, because he really thinks that the quality of a society's culture is of extraordinary importance. So sometimes I try to prime the pump by asking students at the outset whether it's more important for a culture to have good poetry or good medicine. And students think that the answer is obvious, but when I point out that almost no cultures had very good medicine until antibiotics, but there were good cultures, then they can enter into that debate more fully. And that's the context for Alexander Pope's Dunciad. When you do the papers on Swift and Pope, you may need to use the scholarly edition, you may not, but let's talk sometime in the next day or two about putting these on reserve. This is the Twickenham or Twickenham edition of Pope's poetry. And so this has both the 1729 Dunciad and the 1743 Dunciad.
Woo!
And it has great footnotes. And I've marked a couple of places where these books begin. So you can see Pope's satirical advertisement for the 1729 Dunciad, and then you can see all of the prefatory material, all of which is satirical, for the 1742 or 1743 Dunciad. Let's do it the same way, Generals. I'll start with you. And then when I was in college, I had a friend who went to Yale, and in the Yale Christian Fellowship, there was a young man, now quite a prominent sociologist, who imitated the Dunciad in the year of the bicentennial, which was 1976, and he calls it the bicentenniad. So in this case, the people who are being satirized are Nixon and the various political figures during 1976, and he must have taken probably Maynard Mack's course in Pope at Yale. Very, very funny. Well, funny to some of us anyway. So you can see what a college student did many years ago, over 30 years ago. Okay, just a couple of Bible verses that I'm going to come back to in this class. The Pope's poem alludes to epic and it alludes to apocalyptic literature. And so I'm going to just remind you of a couple of verses in Revelation that deal with the end times. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices shouting in heaven, "The whole world has now become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." Right. This is the great passage that Handel uses. And then Revelation 12:17 about the ten-horned beast. You read about the ten-horned fiend in Book 3 of the Dunciad. Then the dragon became angry at the woman and declared war against all the rest of her children. That would be the church in Revelation, the upholders of culture in the way that Pope appropriates it. And now in my vision I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. So Pope makes use of a number of these and many, many more references in Revelation and elsewhere in the New Testament to to allude to apocalyptic literature. And we've talked about allusion in this class, and one of the questions I want you to ask is the purpose of allusion as he's criticizing contemporary culture. Okay, now to begin with. The Dunciad is written and rewritten over many years, and in my view, it's about the cost of a healthy culture. So, as in our previous work with Pope's poetry, we're going to be talking about what it takes to create a healthy culture. Pope, of course, is doing it through poetry, and I think that's the takeaway value of a lot of Pope's satire. What does it cost? Why is it worth it? And what part can I play in it? Well, there's an engraver, very famous engraver and painter, William Hogarth, who lives at the same time as Pope and Swift. Very satirical painter. And he has this painting of the distressed poet. And I was just searching the other day and found that in the first edition of this engraving in 1740, he actually placed some of these elements from the Dunciad, actually one of the earlier versions, under this engraving. So I'll just read it for you. Studious he sat, with all his books around, sinking from thought to thought, a vast profound. So he's sinking into the, do you remember the word that Pope uses in Friday's class for the profound, the depths? He writes a book, Bathos. Yeah, he's sinking into the bathos. Plunged for his sense, but found no bottom there. Then wrote and floundered on in mere despair. So here's the poet searching for something to write about. He's knocking off his wig here. It's about to come off. His baby is hungry, is lying, squalling in the background. This woman she has all the bills that he hasn't paid, and his wife is doing her best to keep up with things, but her husband hasn't produced anything worth selling, and so they're deeper and deeper into poverty. So this is Hogarth's satirical engraving on the distressed poet. Okay, well, let me say a word about the background to the Dunciad. We're going to go quickly through the first two books, then I'm going to get you into the small groups that I mentioned. I gave you various passages in the Dunciad to look at, right? So you'll get in your small groups as quickly as I can manage, and I'll give you some time to think about the key questions, and then we'll come back together. So let me say a word about the publication history of this poem, and then we'll talk about the different books of the Dunciad. First of all, the plot. The plot of the Dunciad is very simple. As in most satires, plot is not really that important. The plot is moving the seat of government, if you will, the seat of dullness, duncery, from one end of London to Westminster. So again, here's our map of London. You really need to know a little bit about London geography for the 18th century, certainly. So London ends about here, and do you remember the St. Paul's Cathedral is about here? Do you remember the street where the poets lived? Grub Street is up here. That's where the poets, or the hack writers live. It's not where Pope lives, of course. It's also where what hospital is up here? So Bethel is up here. Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane is up here. And this is an area called Smithfield. And Smithfield gets mentioned in the opening lines. It's referred to. So this is Temple Bar. This separates London from Westminster. And this is where, to this day, it's a more fashionable area. The theaters are in here. They're kind of on the edge. But this is where the court lives. So this is where the people with good taste should be. This is the city, which is like Wall Street. And this is where you would expect people with not very good taste to live. So the plot is where the goddess of dullness moves from where she should be, which is in the city, Smithfield, to Westminster. That's all that happens. That's all that happens. Moving her seat from one place to the next. That's the plot. Not the most important thing about the poem. Okay, so let's look at the different versions of the Dunciad. In the first versions, the hero, in quotation marks, the mock hero, is Louis Tybalt, spelled Theobald, but pronounced Tybalt. And he's the one, you may remember, who criticizes Pope's edition of Shakespeare. So he's another many bad poets of the 18th century. And he's the chief dunce in the first Dunciad. So there's 3 books in the first version, and then he produces a variorum edition. Do any of you know what a variorum edition of literary work is? Variorum? Can you guess? Sort of. It does talk about variety. It includes all editions, all works. It includes all of the different variant readings. So poets are always changing versions of their poetry. Have any of you compared versions of one poem that the poet wrote at one time in his or her life and then another version later? Have any of you done that in English classes?
We're doing it in Shakespeare right now.
Okay, yeah. So a variorum Shakespeare is extremely helpful because you can see how the folio and quarto changes, right? So a scholar wants to have a variorum edition of Shakespeare, a variorum edition of Yeats. Yeats changes. And so Pope gratifies the scholar's tastes by giving them a variorum edition of the Dunciad. So you have all of the different variant readings of Duncery possible. This is a book that's a satire on books. And we've seen that elsewhere in this class, right? For instance, satires on books themselves.
Gulliver's Travels.
The Battle of the Books, Gulliver's Travels, Tale of a virtually everything we've read has been a satire on books themselves. So it's very self-conscious, the 18th century, about the new print culture, as it's called. All right, then time goes by. The poet laureate at the time, Lawrence Eusden, yet another terrible poet of the 18th century, dies in 1730, and a true dunce is named to be the next poet laureate, Colley Cibber. It was too wonderful to pass up. Okay, so time passes. Colley Cibber is now poet laureate. Pope writes a fourth book of the Dunciad, so now there are 4 books. And then in 1743, he revises the entire work a year before his death and makes Colley Cibber the chief dunce. And that's the version that you have. You have the 1743 edition. Actually, the story doesn't even end there. His friend William Warburton, I think I mentioned, puts in new notes sometime after Pope dies, and Warburton's notes are now part of the Dunciad, part of the things that we study in this poem. Okay, so that's the publication history. Helpful to know. The contents of the 4 books also are, it's not the most important thing, but I'll have to tell you, I found it very confusing to read the first time. In fact, the first couple of times I found it confusing to read. So here's what goes on in the books, just for your information. In Book 1, the most important thing is that Colley Cibber is anointed to be the king of the dunces. Okay? He was made poet laureate in 1730, so this is a poem in praise of his kingdom. In Book 2, epic games go on. As in any good epic poem, there are epic games, and they celebrate his kingship. In Book 3, you have to have a visit to the underworld, right? You remember, I mean, any epic you've read, just give me an example of an epic that has a visit to the underworld in it.
Aeneid.
What? The Aeneid. And what happens when Aeneas goes down with the Sibyl to the underworld? Maybe we'll ask Roberta or Joel. Their memories may be fresher. He gets a vision of... He does, yeah. Anchises comes in later, having died. He sees Anchises.
Doesn't he also get a vision of his goal, like his
Exactly. He gets a vision of his goal. He gets a vision of Rome. And so Colley Cibber, or the king of the dunces, gets some kind of a vision in the underworld, like any good. Now the underworld, could you pick up on what the underworld actually is in Book 3 of the Dunciad? It is the sewers. It is the sewers of London. So this being a modern epic or mock epic, it has to be realistic and translate the underworld into the sewers. Okay, and then in Book 4, finally the Empire of Dullness expands not only to Westminster, but to all of Britain, and it buries everything in darkness. So by ending in darkness, how does that allude to a biblical theme? Anybody? By closing out the world in darkness, let's just think biblically about darkness and light. John?
It's like the opposite of creation.
It is the opposite of creation, exactly. Pope is alluding to creation and its opposite. It's kind of Augustinian, just to connect with some other things you've studied, because darkness, of course, will be the privation of light in every sense, every metaphorical sense of that. Universal darkness buries all. So that's what happens in the four books of the Dunciad. Let's see. The Dunciad announces itself as a mock epic. If you read the prefatory material, we'll read the opening lines. It's clear that it is a mock epic. And so, like any good epic, it has all kinds of expected elements. The title, Dunciad, like Aeneid and Iliad, it opens with an invocation. The muse that's invoked is going to be one of Pope's friends. It alludes to the Aeneid and Paradise Lost and other epics in many places, so there are many allusions to epics. It has a sacrifice to the goddess of dullness, the queen of dullness in Book 1, and then Epic Games' visit to the underworld and so on. So clearly this is a mock epic. No question there. I want to talk about a different set of structures in the Dunciad. Just call your attention to it. I think this is what makes it so profound, really. And that is allusions to apocalyptic literature, or as biblical scholars use the term apocalyptic. This heightens the significance of the Dunciad, in my view, because it makes the reader consider whether we're coming to a crisis point in culture. That's what apocalyptic is about. One of the former Old Testament professors here at Bethel summarized it very nicely for me. He said, apocalyptic is good news and bad times. Good news and bad times. It's not really about prediction, what's going to happen. It's about good news for God's people when they're suffering. And in Pope's case, that would be good news to people who care about culture at a time when culture is suffering. So he uses all of these allusions to apocalyptic in the Dunciad, in my view, to strengthen his critique. And here's just a list of some of the ones that I could get on an overhead. Sure. Either 18th century or earlier images of the Antichrist, images from biblical literature, not from Pope or not from poetry, but images in Western European art. The goddess of dullness rules in the Dunciad, and here's a picture of the Great Mother who's mentioned in Revelation, kind of a mock God the Father. And you notice she has the papal tiara on, the 3 crowns. Pope doesn't wear that anymore. Here's the 7-headed beast with 10 horns. So we have the goddess of dullness, and then we have Kali Sibber riding on these dragons. He was the manager of, I believe it was Drury Lane Theater.
Sorry, when you say the prostitution of culture, can you just elaborate a little more on that?
Well, it's like what Swift talked about in Gulliver's Travels, La Puta, right? Book 3 or Voyage 3 of Gulliver's Travels is about the prostitution of knowledge. And in this poem, the Dunciad, Pope thinks that the people who are in charge of culture, the poets, the theater managers, the scholars, are not doing their job. They're being untrue, they're being unfaithful to their calling as scholars, poets, theater managers. So it's a charge of infidelity. So Pope must have some vision of what fidelity is, what true culture would be, and that's what it's our job to discuss and find out. Any other questions before I go on? Well, let's look at the opening, and I'll try to do this very quickly so you have time to think of it. Let's just open at the very beginning, at page 307 in Williams' version. Page 307. This is the opening, so you would expect what in the invocation to an epic or mock epic? The invocation of the muse, and did somebody say gods?
Yeah.
The gods, right? So the muse gets invoked, the gods are usually referred to somehow. Anything else in an invocation?
An outline of the plot.
The plot, yeah, the plot is announced in the very first line. So, April, you get to open.
Kings I sing. Say you, her instruments the great, called to this day by dullness, Jove, and fate, you by whose care, in vain decried and cursed, still dunce the second reigns like dunce the first. Say how the goddess bade Britiana sleep, and poured her spirit o'er the land and deep.
Okay, or the land and deep. The word deep is a very important biblical word, too, by the way, used in apocalyptic contexts. The beast comes up from the deep in Daniel and in Revelation. Okay, so you have this mock trinity, dullness, Jove, and fate. and The Mighty Mother and Her Son, which is a mock, it's a parody of the father and the son. You have the mother and the son, called to this work by dullness, Jove, and fate. How does Dunce II, that would be Colley Cibber, the new poet laureate, reign like Dunce I, the former poet laureate? Okay, Roberta, can you continue, please? In eldest time?
In eldest time, ere mortals writ or read, ere Pallas issued from the thunder's head, the dullness o'er all possessed her ancient right, daughter of chaos and eternal night.
Okay, and chaos and eternal night comes from
Paradise Lost.
Paradise Lost. If in doubt, the answer is either Jesus or Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to know Hoover sex.
That's 18th century poetry.
What did you say?
When
My
about
God.
Hoover sex?
Okay, here's Paradise Lost, Book 1. All the while, sonorous metal-blowing martial sounds at which the universal host upsent a shout that tore hell's concave and beyond, frightened the reign of chaos and old night. Chaos and old night is where Satan lives. It's hell. It's unformed creation, and it's darkness. Unformed creation and darkness, that's hell for Milton. And everybody reading Pope will know that. And so this poem is about uncreation. Uncreation. It's not about the struggle between an obvious good and an obvious evil. That's the kind of stuff we can, I think, more easily get into. We can understand that. If there's a clear good side and a bad side. This is about undoing creation. All right, so we go through Book 2. There are these various epic games. Do you remember what they do in these epic games? The activities?
Don't they tickle each other?
Tickle each other. They swim in the sewer, and they have a urinating contest. Did you get that? Very junior high boy stuff. Okay, so that's their contest. Okay, now that brings us up to books 3 and 4. The Visit to the Underworld is Book 3, and then the great conclusion in Book 4. So I'd like you to spend at least 15 minutes, read the passage out loud, read your passage out loud, and continue to get into this poem. Pope is obviously having a good time criticizing the people he dislikes. But I think there's a serious issue involved. And it's the issue of culture. How is a good culture produced? He's talking about poetry and theater, but he's talking about, and scholarship, but he's talking about more than that. He's talking about our culture as a whole. So how is it produced? And do you think it's as important or do you think it's important in ways, in the same way that Pope does, or do you view it differently? And a kind of a fun question. You can start here if you want. What figures or groups should be satirized in today's Dunciad? That might be fun too, and it may help to start there, because then you'll have to ask yourself if you think it's as serious as Pope does. So here are your groups. Did I divide the Romanticism group in half already? No? Okay, good. So the Romanticism group, you have this, and everybody else has these lines. So can you go ahead and get in your groups, and let's get back together at 12:05. So you have a good 15 minutes. If you want to go somewhere else, that's okay. If you can make it inside and back out by 12:05, that's fine too.
His beavered brow and birchen garland wears, dropping with infant's blood and mother's tears. O'er every vein a shuddering horror rise. Eton and Winton shake through all their sons. All flesh is humbled, Westminster's bold race shrink, and confess the genius of the place. The pale boy senator yet tingling stands, and holds his breeches close with both his hands.
Then thus. Since man of bees by words is known, words are man's province, words we teach alone. When reason doubtful like the senior letter points him two ways, the narrower is the better. Placed at the door of learning, youth to guide, we never suffer it to stand.
Phony Trinity. he referred to the Trinity in book 1.
Yeah.
Okay, but the end is really great, so you should.
Okay. She comes, this sable throne, behold, of night primeval and of chaos old.
Before the things are adorning illness.
That helps.
Then why is
Which
morality?
your Gulliver Con?
Morality is
Gulliver Pro.
being guarded by chicane.
By her false guardian angel.
Yeah. So like she's in bondage
So then
as
it
well.
goes back.
Yeah.
And then the chicane and I still don't know are just worthless. Are just like worthless arguments and like things pretending to be like logic.
I think it's Boeotia. I've never actually heard anybody say it. Boeotia, but it's a region, I think, in Asia Minor. But the important thing is that people there are thought to be stupid. And it's also rainy. And so if you're criticizing Ireland in the 18th century, you call it Boeotia. But it can just be a name for any kind of backward area.
What do you want to do with your art major? What do you want to do with your theater major or whatever? And I mean, those, I feel like in academia, or at least in this setting, they're kind of devalued sometimes and looked down upon as not practical or whatever. Whereas like biology, science, chemistry, and the things that Bethel is really, known for, I guess, at least for pre-med, are kind of held on this different footing, when in reality, like, popes used art and obviously literature as a science. I mean, for back then as well, but they're equally as important and grouped in the same setting as the sciences that we know now. So I feel like that's kind of a change.
And now they're seen more for like entertainment purposes instead of like another way to gain knowledge or like another.
Right.
Metaphysics calls for eight on sense. Thinking that you can base every aspect of your philosophy on sense perception, which is a kind of scientific, in quotation marks, approach. Modern scientists today don't believe that. But in the 18th century, they thought you could get rid of any metaphysical, religious bases. See, mystery to mathematics flight. Mystery is religious. Actually, I looked into this. I have some thoughts about this a lot.
Writer culture, because we talked about this in senior sem the other day, but people who like go to coffee shops like tend to look all, yeah, and just sit there and like listen to their tunes. They don't actually read.
Really super alienated. I go in there and I just come out with a black beret on it. They make great coffee though, right? Yes. Okay. So writer culture, Christian movies, what else? Zach?
Oh no, I was just walking into the Dumb Brothers and then you just start reading with your legs crossed.
There you go. Yeah. You see, Leah, he's fun and he's funny. Okay. Any other Dunciad nominees?
We were thinking that with our section he might say Bethel because it has a Christian education which goes against a couple of the lines that he has about mixing like religion and like math or something, even like I mean they don't need to mix, but here they do.
Okay. All right. Well, the fact is, you can satirize many things. The world seems to be made for satire. So let's start at the beginning here. This is a very difficult passage. This is kind of another invocation. So let's look at page 339, please. 339. Now, do you share any of Pope's concerns about culture today, or is it just where do you see that? Can you make any connections? Bring up any concerns that you have about our own culture? Kirsten, you were nodding a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think that I was saying that a lot of times, like, in reading this stuff, I'm like, oh, our culture is so horrible, and, it's just in, like, the future, looking from his time period that, like, all this stuff was happening, but I actually think it's kind of inspiring almost to like read something like this, because we know that bad culture exists all the time. And so I like that. Because we're just never, I mean, you're never going to escape it, because, I don't know, I mean, it's kind of like, you always have to have something that's the opposite to realize that, oh, this is good, and we like this. So.
Let evil flourish that grace might abound.
Sure.
Right. Well, Pope does need, I mean, Pope was born at the right time for his particular kind of wit. Well, there's so much here, but we need to go on. The satire on criticism. There are a couple of, where's my Burns group? A couple of good lines in this too. Tell us what Pope is saying about literary criticism here.
The main thing that we got from this was that he thinks that critics of his day were really concerned with things that didn't really have much bearing on anything in the real world. So, like, how to pronounce Cicero.
Is it Cicero or Cicero? Have any of you had Latin where they talk about this? They do talk about this.
Didn't they get rid of the
Latin? They got rid of Latin.
Yeah, but you could have had it in high school. Okay, let's look at what page is that Cicero thing on?
The Cicero thing is on 363.
363. Yeah, you'll find that contemporary critic Richard Bentley, whom we met in the Battle of the Books, he felt very strongly that it should be Cicero and not Cicero. Okay, and they still, I mean, my teacher talked about that in college when I learned those languages. And to sink in kano, a or a. Okay, here's the deal. Let's go back to page 360. Page 360, line 149. Then thus, since man from beast by words is known, words are man's province. Words we teach alone. Have you had classes or read literary theory is full of this, folks, where an emphasis on one word will supposedly give you the key to unlock or deconstruct the meaning of an entire work. So instead of looking at the whole work, which is what Pope recommends in the Essay on Criticism, you're focusing on individual words and finding some key to understanding. As opposed to merely focusing on words, what is Pope urging us? What does he care about? This is not just a question for this group. He's concerned about deeper things. He's concerned about, a kind of humane life, a larger humanity. Anything else you want to add?
He just says a lot of things on the last page on 364. I just love his line where he says, the critic eye, that microscope of wit, sees hairs and pores, examines bit by bit. And then later
what line are we? Okay.
Oh, around
233. Amy is thinking of her past history and biology classes, right?
Yeah. And then he says, the body's harmony, the beaming soul, all things which Custer Berman watch shall see, when man's whole frame is obvious to a flea. It's just, says it all.
Okay. It's this partial knowledge that Pope is concerned about, as opposed to a broader sense. So what Pope is calling for is a critique of these contemporary writers and contemporary intellectuals, and urging a different kind of culture, a deeper culture, a culture where religion, metaphysic, and good taste actually had a role, as opposed to the reign of the expert that only looks through the microscope, or the philologist that only looks at individual words, and certainly not the kind of sensual and spectacle-ridden culture that Britain has at the time. Okay, well, thanks very much, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Yeah, in the segment that was filmed, I thought the classroom presentation that I did about Pope's poem, the Dunciad, went pretty well. I felt like I had the students with me for most of that. But then I broke them into small groups and had them look at different sections of the poem, and that didn't go so well, in my view. I think it's because it's a very complicated poem, and yet I felt like I wanted them to get certain things out of it in retrospect, and that's probably not the best way to do a small group exercise in class. So I would do that differently. Have the students do sections of a poem where they're freer to find out things on their own, and where I don't have an agenda for what they should get. Well, I'll start by saying why I do them and why I like doing them. The first one I did was an England term in 1991, so that was my 6th year at Bethel. And it took me that long to realize how important relationships really were between the professor and the student. And that comes more naturally to other people, I know. But for me, it was that experience of seeing the friendship, the fun we had together, working with the classroom experience that was it really revolutionized my teaching. And so I like going back to that. It's like going back to the well and getting refreshed every so often. The other thing it made me realize is that the long-term relationships that I'll have with students come largely from those very intense experiences. And on my wall behind me are pictures mostly of students that I've taken abroad, not entirely. And when we get together, the conversation flows naturally about things we experienced at a particular place. So that association of place and intellect and spirit, there's a lot of spiritual growth as well as just enjoyment. Now, in terms of organizing it, I would say that taking a study abroad trip is not for everybody. You really do have to enjoy doing details, or your spouse has to enjoy doing details. And so I'm pretty good with organizing logistics and envisioning what's going to come next. So it's kind of a natural for me. But I think it's not for everybody. Well, that's a good question. I think it's an important one at Bethel for us to continue to think about. And I think there are 3 different ways that it works for me. Sometimes the course material naturally leads into some element of faith, and I'll give an odd example. I always teach Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon literature at the beginning of the school year, and the worst crime in that culture is starting a feud. And so the biblical passage that they like the most is Cain and Abel. So the course material in that case gives me an opportunity to integrate the Cain and Abel story and show how it worked in that culture. So course material is one. A second is if I do sense some kind of pastoral issue in the class. It may be something that's happening at Bethel, or it may be, it could even just be after a festival of Christmas, or a lot of students being ill. So I may integrate a faith and a prayer in that way. The third is more seasonal. Bethel students sometimes respond to the liturgical year because it's unfamiliar to them. And so I'll often bring up readings during Advent or Lent, or lectionary readings from one of the historic churches. So those 3 different ways: the seasons, sort of pastoral issues, and then course material. Well, balance is always it's a topic that we talk about a lot and that we never really solve. I do think part of it depends on your station in life. if you're married, you have certain responsibilities. If you have small children, you have other responsibilities. Now our kids are grown, and so I do feel a little bit more of responsibility to do more service in terms of committees and so a willingness to take on more in that respect. And there were times when I was doing more scholarly work where I didn't do very much of that, or I did less. Scholarship, I think, is the hardest for me because I can't really do scholarship during the school year, and so I did a lot over the summers. And again, I think that's really important for a lot of people individually, and it's important to get tenure and promotion to full professor. But I feel that there are times in life when you can set that aside too and concentrate more on one than the other. So I guess my short answer is there are seasons in life and times of greater and lesser responsibility where you can give more attention to one than the other. And I think trying to do all three all the time is a recipe for breakdown. This is a great question. I really do look forward to the beginning of the school year. And I think it's because I realize that if I were working on my own, if I were only working on my own, or if there weren't a academic year coming up, I'd be lonely and melancholy and depressed. And so I recognize that I like students. I don't continue to teach primarily for scholarly purposes. I think that's valuable, but it's for me it is not the primary focus. But I have a strong sense of duty as well, and I think we have a duty as Christians living in a democracy to educate the generation so that they're responsible. I mean, it's kind of a basic citizenship thing. So when I see 130 humanities students carrying Tocqueville under their arms, or Lincoln or Frederick Douglass, I think we're doing a good thing. And seeing them get involved in those discussions is really thrilling. Or seeing students get passionate about poetry for the first time. I love to see that. So it really does come down primarily to being able to see students catch the fire of the intellectual life. I do have some advice on the first year. For the first year at Bethel, I would say get some good advice on developing an interim course, because interim can be a real pain if you aren't teaching something that you enjoy and something that actually works in 16 class days. So you have your first interim off, get a good interim course. For the fifth year, I remember John Lawyer said something about the 5 to 7 year period of discontent or of questioning, and it's kind of like a marriage, really. And he compared it to being in a monastery. Monks have to renegotiate their relationship with the institution, and I think that's true for us as well. I think at that point you need to ask yourself if you're willing to bend your interests to the interests and the culture of this institution, because things will have come up in those first 5 years where you see that the institution is different from your own background. And if you're not willing to bend in certain ways, then it may be time to move on. And if you're willing to undergo the strain of changing, then that's a good sign. but just recognizing that necessity. For the 15th year, I would say it's time to lead or reinvent yourself. When I look at the people at Bethel who are doing the most valuable things or seem the happiest, it's because they've changed their job in some way that fits with the institution and fits with themselves. So in our department, Thomas Becknell has really contributed to the environmental studies program. We all know how Dick Peterson has established relationships with companies and schools. I think this way of reconceiving your vocation is something that all of us can do and probably need to do. It could be leadership inside Bethel, or it could be some way we relate to the community or the world. But I think that's a pretty natural cycle. When I look back at the things that have provided refreshment for me, they all do come down to paying attention to and following my own interests within the context of Bethel. So for me, leading students abroad has been tremendously refreshing. They really can't get at you with email when you're abroad if you don't turn your computer on. Taking students abroad. Secondly, team teaching has been a tremendous refreshment. To find faculty who have somewhat like minds, but different approaches to these various subjects and different ways of teaching, for me, that has been hugely refreshing. So finding ways that your own interests intersect with Bethel's and then following them in new ways is what's been best for me. Well, I would be happy if some form of the humanities program continued. And the program isn't as important as just the passion of students to enter conversations that have been going on for hundreds and thousands of years. That is what got me interested in higher education and in reading in the first place. And if there's a way that I can pass that on, that's what I would love to be my legacy.